The Red Sea parts inside your skull. Exodus chapter 14, verse 22 says the waters became a wall on your right and your left. That wall is the falx cerebri, a vertical membrane in the longitudinal fissure, the cleft between your two hemispheres. You are not being told to wait for an ocean to split. You are being shown the inner crossing you were born with, a body of water, miles wide, deep enough to drown an entire army, splits clean down the middle, stands in two vertical walls defying every known property of fluid dynamics all night long, holds perfectly still, while somewhere between 1 and 2 million people walk the muddy seabed in the dark, then slams shut on command at dawn. Outside the text, the record is quiet, so the passage forces you back onto what it is actually doing. The Hebrew does not say Red Sea. It says Yam Suph, which can be read as Sea of Reeds or Sea at the end. It does not say Egypt. It says Mitzrayim, a word heard in Hebrew with the flavor of constriction, the narrows, even if its original coinage is debated. Later translation tradition rendered Yam Suph as Red Sea and Mitzrayim as Egypt, pushing readers toward geography. And once those two words became places on a map, the inner reading receded from view. This is not a travel story. It is an inner temple blueprint of your skull, and the parting it describes corresponds to the longitudinal fissure, the great cleft that divides your brain into two hemispheres. If you keep this literal, you are waiting for a God who parts external oceans while the actual crossing sits inside your own cranium, unused, every single day. By the end of this video, you will see the wall, the waters, the dry ground, and the crossing, all named, all inside your skull, and we will walk them verse by verse against the anatomy you carry right now. Now let us deal with the surface reading, because it deserves to be dealt with honestly. The scale alone should give you pause. Exodus chapter 12, verse 37 numbers the men at 600,000, not counting women and children. Conservative estimates put the total group at over 1 million people. Walking 4 abreast on a path wide enough to stay dry, that column stretches over 100 miles. They crossed in one night, in the dark, on a wet seabed, with livestock, and the text says the waters stood as walls, vertical, stable, on both sides for the entire duration. The description does not behave like ordinary water. It reads like engineered architecture. The detail is not vague enough to be metaphor and not plausible enough to be reportage. It sits in a category all its own, and that category is instruction. Look at the architectural precision. Verse 22 does not just say they crossed. It specifies the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left, not behind them, not above them, right and left. That is not how a journalist describes a flood event. That is how a cartographer describes a structure. And when the text repeats this line almost word for word in verse 29, it is doing what Hebrew narrative always does with repetition. It is telling you, this is the key. Pay attention to the walls. The allegorical reading of this passage is not new. Philo of Alexandria, 1st century, was already reading the Exodus as an inner journey. Egypt as the life of bodily passions, the crossing as the soul's transition to the spiritual life. Origen, 3rd century, told his catechumens directly, "It is in you that they all find their spiritual fulfillment." Origen's allegorical approach was later treated with suspicion and condemned in that era. The details are debated by scholars, but the effect was a narrowing of acceptable readings. The inner tradition did not die, but it lost its place in the mainstream. This is not a new reading. It is among the oldest. It simply lost institutional protection. The longitudinal fissure runs the entire length of your cerebrum. It is a deep, dramatic cleft that divides your brain into left and right hemispheres, visible from the top of the skull all the way down. At the front and rear, the separation extends completely. In the middle, a bridge spans the gap. The sea in your skull is already parted. It has been parted since before you were born. This is anatomical correspondence, a symbolic map, not a medical claim. and the Hebrew text describes it with a precision that should stop you cold. When we get to verse 21, watch the verb. It does not say parted. It says Baqa, ripped open, and that verb will show you what the fissure actually does. Let us look at the Hebrew architecture underneath this passage. The verb in Exodus chapter 14, verse 16 is Baqa, Strong's H1234. It does not mean to part the way you part a curtain. It means to cleave, to rip open, to split apart by force. It appears over 50 times in the Hebrew Bible, and its usage carries violence, tearing, breaking through, ripping up. When the text says God divided the sea, it uses a word that describes structural rupture. The longitudinal fissure is not a gentle fold. It is the primary structural cleft of the cerebrum, a division so deep and so total that the two hemispheres are connected only by a single bridge of white matter deep within. Baqa is the right verb for what this fissure does. Now look at Mitzrayim. This is not just a name. It is a dual-form noun. The suffix ayim signals two of something, and it shares the root letters of tsar, which means narrow, pressed in, constricted. Related words include metzar, meaning strait or distress, and matzor, meaning siege. Whether Mitzrayim was originally coined with this root in mind is debated, but the resonance is unmistakable in the Hebrew ear, and the biblical writers exploit it. Psalm chapter 118, verse 5 makes the wordplay explicit. From the narrows, min-ha-metzar, I cried out to the Lord, and he answered me in a wide open place. The psalmist uses a word that sounds like Mitzrayim to describe constriction, then contrasts it with expansion. In our inner reading, Egypt is not a country on the map. It is the condition of being pressed in, and the Exodus is the way out of that narrowness. Moses, is equally precise. Exodus chapter 2, verse 10 gives the folk etymology. Pharaoh's daughter says, I drew him out of the water. But the Hebrew form, Moshe, is an active participle. It can mean the one who draws out, not the passive, the one drawn from water. The grammatical form opens a second reading beneath the surface. Moses is not only the rescued baby. Moses is the active extraction principle, the function in you that draws consciousness out of the waters of the lower mind. And Pharaoh, from the Egyptian pair Aa, meaning great house. The Bible itself gives us the inner key, not through the name, but through the repeated accusation. Over and over, Scripture calls Israel stiff-necked. In Hebrew, kashe oref, hardened at the back of the neck. And it is Pharaoh who embodies this hardening more than anyone. His heart is hardened. He will not bend. He will not release. The neck, oref, is the junction between skull and spine, and the entire Exodus drama turns on whether that junction softens or stays rigid. The hardening of Pharaoh is the refusal to let the current pass upward. Then there is the force that does the dividing. Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. The Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind. The Hebrew is Ruach qadim. Ruach means wind, breath, and spirit, all three. And it is the same word used in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, when the Spirit moved over the face of the waters. Qadim means from the east, but the root qadam can mean to come before, to be in front. The force that parts the sea is the same force that hovered over the primordial waters at creation. It is breath. It is spirit. And the text does not distinguish between them because in the Hebrew they are one word. That is the verb baqa and the force ruach. Now verse 22 contains the most anatomically precise line in the Torah. Let us see what the wall is made of. Exodus chapter 14, verse 13. Moses speaks to the people. Fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord. The Hebrew for hold your peace in the next verse is sharash, to be silent, to be still, to plow in quietness. Before anything parts, before any crossing begins, the instruction is to stop. Stop moving, stop reacting, stand still. This is not a military command. This is a stillness instruction. Be silent and let the Lord, the inner principle, do the work. Verse 16. God tells Moses, "Lift thou up thy rod, and stretch out thine hand over the sea, and divide it." The rod is mate, Strong's H4294, and here is the hidden detail. The verse pairs mate with the verb nata, to stretch out, to extend. The instruction itself is extension. Take the staff and stretch out your hand. The word for the instrument and the word for the action echo each other inside the same command. The staff corresponds to the spine, the body's central rod, the thing that is stretched out from sacrum to skull. When the staff is lifted, the current rises. Verses 19 and 20. The angel of God and the pillar of cloud move from in front of Israel to behind them, standing between the two camps. The text is specific about what this pillar does. It was a cloud and darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these. One side receives darkness, the other receives light. The same structure, the same position, produces two different experiences depending on which side you are on. In correspondence, the falx cerebri stands between the two hemispheres in exactly this way. A single vertical membrane dividing the brain into two sides that process reality differently. As an inner map, the left hemisphere tends to sequence, categorize, narrow. The right hemisphere tends to integrate, perceive wholeness, open. Darkness to one, light to the other. The pillar stands between. Verse 21. Moses stretches out his hand. The Ruach qadim blows all night. The sea becomes dry land. The waters are divided, Baqa, ripped open, all night. This is not a quick event. It takes the entire dark period. Extended, sustained breath, Ruach, working through the hours of stillness, is what opens the fissure between the two modes of mind. And then, verse 22. Read it slowly. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. A wall, choma, on the right, on the left. The falx cerebri is a large, crescent-shaped fold of dura mater, the brain's tough outer membrane, that descends vertically into the longitudinal fissure. It is a wall standing in the parted cleft, with the two hemispheres on either side. And it houses the superior sagittal sinus, a channel of venous blood running along its upper edge. A wall with red fluid running through it, standing between two halves, with cerebrospinal fluid, the waters, flowing alongside it. Waters, wall, right and left. The text is not poetry. It is a receipt. When we hit verse 22, you are looking at the most anatomically precise line in the Torah. Waters standing as a wall on your right and on your left. And that is exactly what the falx cerebri does. Now, what is the dry ground they walk on? Because there is a structure that bridges the gap between the hemispheres, and it has a name. Exodus chapter 14, verse 22, says they walked on dry ground, yabasha, through the midst of the sea. The corpus callosum is the largest white matter structure in the human brain. It contains hundreds of millions of nerve fibers and spans part of the longitudinal fissure connecting the left and right hemispheres. It sits deep within the fissure, forming the floor of the cleft with the falx cerebri hanging just above it. It is the only major crossing point between the two parted halves. Dry matter, in the midst of the waters. The corpus callosum, from the Latin meaning tough body, is the dry ground through the midst of the sea. Without it, the two hemispheres operate largely independently. The crossing is not symbolic. The crossing is structural. Now watch what happens to the Egyptians. Verse 24. And it came to pass that in the morning watch the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians. The morning watch, the Ashmeret Haboker, is the last watch of the night, the deepest hours before dawn. This is correspondence, not a medical claim, but in the inner reading, these are the hours of the deepest internal processing. The pineal gland sits deep near the midline of the brain, between the two hemispheres, close to the third ventricle. The Lord looks through the pillar at the Egyptians during the deepest hours, and what he sees, he troubles. Verse 25 gives us the mechanism of that troubling. And took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily. Here is the hidden detail. The wheels come off before the drowning. The ego's pursuit mechanisms are dismantled first. The drive systems fail. The Egyptians themselves recognize it. They say, "Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians." The lower mind sees its own defeat before the waters close. The dismantling precedes the dissolution. Verses 27 and 28. Moses stretches out his hand again. The sea returns to its strength, and the waters returned, and covered the chariots and the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. Not so much as one. This is total. When the crossing completes, the constricted identity, Mitzrayim, the narrow place, does not survive in part. It does not negotiate a partial return. It is fully submerged. And then verse 29 repeats the architecture. But the children of Israel walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. The text states the wall line twice, verse 22 and verse 29, bookending the drowning. Hebrew repetition is never accidental. It is emphasis. The wall, the fissure, the two sides. This is the spine of the entire chapter, and the text wants you to see it twice so you do not miss it. The dry ground is named. The drowning is mapped. Now, where does the journey end? Because Exodus 15 names the destination, and it is not a country. Exodus chapter 15, verse 8, gives us the most physiologically explicit line in the Song of the Sea. And with the blast of thy nostrils, the waters were gathered together. The floods stood upright as an heap, and the depths were congealed in the heart of the sea. The Hebrew is Ruach apeka, the breath of your nostrils. Same root word, Ruach, but now the text specifies where it comes from. The nostrils, the nose, the face. The mechanism of the parting is breath, and the text names the body part through which that breath operates. The language is bodily enough to function like a manual, an inner temple blueprint. And then Exodus chapter 15, verse 17, names the destination. Thou shalt bring them in, and plant them in the mountain of thine inheritance, in the place, O Lord, which thou hast made for thee to dwell in the sanctuary, O Lord, which thy hands have established. Three descriptors: a mountain, a dwelling place, a sanctuary. Not a flat land of milk and honey, not a coastal territory. A mountain that is also a dwelling, that is also a sanctuary. In our decode, the skull is the mountain, the brain is the dwelling, the inner chambers are the sanctuary. The journey from Mitzrayim, constriction, ends at the mountain temple. It always did. One more layer. Exodus chapter 14, verse 7 says Pharaoh took 600 chosen chariots. In Hebrew gematria, Certain traditions assign the value 600 to the letter mem, and mem means water. Whether you follow that numbering convention or not, the resonance is worth noting. The pursuing force is stamped with the number of water, the element that destroys them. And Midrashic tradition holds that the sea divided into 12 paths, one for each tribe. 12 paths through the parted waters of the skull, where 12 cranial nerves thread through the cranium. Not a proof, an overlay that matches the number and the root. The skull is the mountain. The brain is the dwelling. The inner chambers are the sanctuary. The crossing ends where it was always heading, the temple between your ears. Now the practice. Because the text gave you the instruction in verse 13. Exodus chapter 14, verse 13. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. The Ruach, the breath, is what divides the waters. The text gave you the method before it gave you the map. Stillness first, breath second. The sea parts on its own. First, sit still. Close your eyes. Do nothing for 30 seconds. This is verse 13. Stand still. Let the chariots behind you be. Do not fight them. Do not turn around to face what pursues you. Be sharash, silent. Second, breathe in slowly through the nose. 4 counts in, hold for 2, out for 6. This is the Ruach qadim, the breath from the front. Feel the air enter the nostrils. Exodus chapter 15, verse 8. The blast of thy nostrils. On each exhale, feel the space between the 2 sides of your head, the fissure, the parting, the opening, 5 full cycles. Third, on the final exhale, let the jaw soften completely. The mouth does not clench. The neck does not harden. The stiff neck, the oref, the pharaoh pattern. Let the mate, the spine, lengthen. Feel the staff straighten from sacrum to skull. Sit in the open space for 60 seconds. You are on dry ground. You stood still. The breath moved. The sea parted. You crossed. The old pursuit drowned behind you. This is Exodus 14, and it happened in the last 3 minutes.